Audrey was exhausted. After a long day at work, all she wanted was a moment of peace. The house was silent, the street outside deserted, and the moon shone brightly, casting soft shadows through the windows. She collapsed onto the living room sofa, seeking some entertainment on the TV before bed. There was nothing special on that early morning. The programming was the same as always, repetitive and dull, but Audrey didn't mind. She just wanted to turn off her mind and let the fatigue take her to sleep. The clock on the wall read 2:30 a.m. With a sigh, Audrey nestled into the sofa, reaching for the remote control. She flipped through a few channels, not finding anything that really caught her attention, until she finally settled on an old series, something comforting and familiar. The house, with its soft and cozy lighting, seemed like the perfect refuge that night. However, as time passed, something strange began to happen. The sound of the TV started to fluctuate, as if there was some interference, a noise that shouldn't be there. Audrey frowned, leaning forward, trying to adjust the volume, but the persistent static was unmistakable. She looked around, hoping it was just a momentary glitch, perhaps a signal failure. But then, the image on the screen began to distort. The colors blended in strange ways, and horizontal lines crossed the picture. Audrey pressed the buttons on the remote, trying to change the channel, but nothing happened. The remote seemed to have lost its function. It was then that the clock on the wall read 2:45 a.m., and the regular programming disappeared completely, giving way to a screen full of dense and noisy static. Audrey felt a chill run down her spine. Something was not right. She slowly stood up, keeping her eyes fixed on the screen, where indistinct figures began to form among the static lines. It was as if the TV was trying to tune into something, but what appeared there was difficult to decipher. Dark spots that looked like shadows dancing, swirling in a macabre choreography. However, before she could decide whether to turn off the TV or simply leave the room, the static began to fade, and a new program, something she had never seen before, started to materialize on the screen. The sense of peace that Audrey had felt minutes earlier was replaced by a growing sense of unease, as if something was about to happen, something terrible. And then, suddenly, the program began. Audrey stood frozen before the TV, her eyes fixed on the screen as the unknown program began to take shape. The image was blurry and in black and white, like an old film, with a grainy quality that made it hard to distinguish the details. At first, it seemed like a poorly made documentary, but there was something deeply unsettling about those images. The shaky camera showed a narrow, poorly lit hallway, with walls covered in faded wallpaper. The silence of the video was broken only by a faint hum, as if the recording was picking up background noise that Audrey couldn't identify. Something about the hallway seemed familiar, but she couldn't say why. As she watched, the camera moved slowly through the space, as if someone was walking, filming each step. Suddenly, the screen flickered, and the image changed to a close-up of a partially open door. The door swung slightly, as if pushed by an invisible draft. Audrey felt a strange sense of déjà vu, but she couldn't look away. Something was definitely wrong with that program, but a morbid curiosity kept her watching. Then, a loud noise burst from the TV speaker, a sharp static sound that made her jump on the sofa. The noise stopped as quickly as it started, but it left Audrey's heart racing. When she looked back at the screen, the door that had been ajar was now wide open, revealing a dark room. Indistinct shadows moved inside, and a sense of dread took hold of her. Audrey gripped the remote tighter, trying to turn off the TV, but the screen didn't respond. The power button wasn't working, nor were the others. The TV seemed to have come to life, completely ignoring her attempts to control it. The feeling of helplessness was suffocating. On the screen, the camera started to approach the dark room. The hum returned, now louder and clearer, like a constant murmur that Audrey could almost understand. The door of the room began to creak, and the hum turned into something else, a low, guttural sound, as if someone was whispering directly in her ear. The shadows in the room seemed to stir, as if aware they were being watched. Audrey felt a cold shiver down her spine, and for a moment, she thought she saw something move in the corner of the room, at the edge of her vision. She turned quickly, but there was nothing there. When she looked back at the TV, the camera had stopped moving, focusing on a fixed spot on the floor of the room. The darkness on the screen seemed to intensify, swallowing the image until all that remained was total blackness, except for a small, bright reflection on the floor. Audrey felt a wave of rising panic. The darkness seemed to spread beyond the screen, as if it was about to escape into the room. She took a step back, finally deciding to leave, but before she could move, the image flickered one last time, and a figure briefly appeared on the screen. The figure of a woman, standing in the middle of the room, staring directly at the camera. The image disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, and the TV returned to static. Audrey stood there, frozen with fear, trying to process what she had just seen. Something was deeply wrong, not just with the TV, but with the house itself. It was 2:50 a.m., and Audrey knew this was only the beginning. Audrey stood still for a few seconds, trying to calm her heart, which was pounding in her chest. The figure of the woman on the screen had been so clear, so real, that she couldn't shake the feeling that somehow that image was trying to communicate with her. Still in shock, Audrey tried to rationalize what had just happened. Perhaps it was a signal problem, some bizarre interference, or an experimental film that had accidentally aired, but a cold, insistent voice inside her told her that it wasn't any of those things. The remote remained useless in her hands. None of the buttons responded, and the TV screen continued to show nothing but static. Audrey felt a shiver run down her spine. The feeling of being watched, which had previously been just a vague impression, now felt almost tangible. The room was dark, but the pale glow from the TV illuminated the contours of the furniture, casting strange shadows on the walls. She slowly stood up, intending to turn off the TV directly by the button on the set. But before she could take a step, the static on the screen began to change again. Small points of light emerged from the background of the image, like stars appearing in a night sky. The lights arranged themselves in a pattern, forming something that looked like a face that stared at her intently. Audrey recoiled instinctively, feeling a wave of panic wash over her. The face on the screen was distorted, as if seen through a broken mirror. The figure's mouth moved slowly, as if trying to speak, but the sound that came from the speakers was a low, indecipherable whisper, almost like the wind blowing through a deep cave. Suddenly, the screen flickered and the face disappeared, replaced by a new image. This time, it was an empty field, with tall grass swaying in the wind. The scene was melancholic, almost desolate, and there was no sound except for the rustling of the grass. The camera moved slowly, as if carried by someone walking through the field. Then, without warning, the image cut to a close-up of something on the ground. A pale hand, half buried in the dirt, the fingers rigid and motionless. Audrey felt a knot in her stomach. The hand looked freshly buried, with the skin still intact but dirty with earth. She tried to look away, but an invisible force kept her fixed on the screen, unable to turn away. The camera remained in the close-up of the hand for a few agonizing seconds before slowly moving to reveal more of what was buried. It was a body, a partially exposed body, covered by a thin layer of dirt and dry leaves. The face of the corpse was turned downward, but the shape was unmistakable. Audrey felt a chill as she realized that the body seemed familiar, as if it was someone she knew. Before she could process what she was seeing, the image changed again. Now, the camera was in a new location, inside a dark and dimly lit house. The room was old, with furniture covered in dust and cobwebs hanging from the corners. The sense of discomfort intensified, and Audrey felt that something was deeply wrong. It wasn't just what was on the screen, but the very air around her seemed heavier, laden with a presence that didn't belong there. The camera continued to move slowly, until it stopped in front of a large old mirror, its edges darkened by time. Audrey saw herself on the screen, but the image in the mirror was distorted. There was something wrong with her reflection. The eyes were empty, lifeless, and the mouth seemed to move, though she wasn't speaking. Then, with a sudden crack, the mirror shattered on the screen and the image disappeared. The TV returned to static, but Audrey couldn't move. She knew that what was on the screen wasn't just a wrong transmission or a strange program. It was something much darker, something that was trying to communicate with her in a way she still didn't understand. The clock on the wall read 2:55 a.m. Audrey began to understand that time was running out, and that the answers to what was happening were connected to that mysterious program. Audrey remained in front of the TV, the pale glow of the screen illuminating her face as the mysterious program continued. The scene now showed the interior of an old, deteriorated house where time seemed to have stopped. The camera slowly wandered through the rooms, capturing details that made Audrey increasingly uncomfortable. Furniture covered in dust, pictures hanging crooked on the walls, and curtains swaying slightly as if something had just passed by them. The feeling that something was deeply wrong began to grow inside her. Every new detail that appeared on the screen seemed to carry weight, an untold story that somehow seemed to connect with Audrey's own house. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had seen that place before, but she couldn't remember where or when. Then, without warning, a low, scratchy sound began to emanate from the TV speakers. It was like nails being dragged across a rough surface, a sound that made Audrey shudder. She looked around, expecting to see something moving in the room, but everything seemed to be in its place. Still, the feeling of being watched persisted, growing with each passing second. Suddenly, the camera on the screen changed direction, focusing on a closed door at the end of the hallway. Audrey felt her heart race as the camera slowly approached the door. Each step, captured with an almost unbearable slowness, seemed to echo in the room where she was, as if the sound was materializing around her. When the camera finally reached the door, there was a moment of absolute silence, and then, without any warning sound, the door opened on its own, revealing a dark room. The darkness seemed to spread out from the screen, invading Audrey's room, as strange shadows began to take shape on the screen. The images were indistinct, but there was something in them that conveyed a silent threat, a presence that seemed eager to cross the barrier between the program and reality. Audrey tried to step back, but her feet felt glued to the floor. She couldn't take her eyes off the TV, as if something was forcing her to watch. The shadows on the screen began to move, sliding along the walls of the room, as if they were looking for something or someone. The scratchy sound returned, louder and closer this time, as if it was coming from inside the room itself. It was then that Audrey realized something that made her blood run cold. The hallway and the room on the screen weren't just random. They were an exact replica of the rooms in her own house. Every detail, from the wallpaper to the furniture, was identical. The only difference was the oppressive darkness that seemed to dominate every corner of the place, shown on the TV. With bated breath, she watched as the camera continued to explore the dark room on the screen. Suddenly, the image changed to a close-up of a disheveled bed where something seemed to be moving under the covers. The scratchy sound grew more intense, now accompanied by a faint murmur, as if several voices were whispering at the same time, but incomprehensibly. Audrey felt a growing panic take hold of her. The feeling that something was terribly wrong intensified, and she finally gathered the strength to move. In a quick motion, she stood up and backed away from the TV, her heart pounding wildly. But before she could decide what to do, the TV screen flickered, and the image of the room was replaced by something much closer. A view of the living room where she was, shown exactly as it was at that moment, with the empty sofa and the TV on. Audrey looked around, expecting to see a hidden camera or some trick, but the room was exactly as the image showed, with no sign of external interference. Panic completely overwhelmed her. How was it possible that the TV was broadcasting a live image of her own living room? And who or what was behind this? And The clock on the wall read 2:57 a.m. Audrey knew she was running out of time, but what exactly was about to happen? The tension continued to build, making it clear that the true terror was yet to come. Panic took hold of Audrey as she stared at the image on the TV, which showed her own living room in real time. It was as if the line between the mysterious program and reality was dissolving, leaving her trapped in a spiral of fear and confusion. She felt her heart pounding in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears like a resounding drum. For a moment, Audrey considered running out of the house, but an inexplicable force kept her anchored in place. Maybe it was the fear of the unknown, or maybe something darker was at play, something that wouldn't let her escape so easily. On the screen, the image of the living room flickered briefly, and a new scene began to take shape. It was the same narrow hallway she had seen before, but now the camera was stopped in front of an old mirror, the same one she had in the entrance of her house. The reflection in the mirror was distorted and blurry, as if something was trying to emerge from within it. Audrey felt a chill run down her spine as she saw her own image appear in the TV mirror. But the reflection seemed wrong. Her expression was empty, and her eyes, lifeless, fixed on a distant point. As Audrey watched, the reflection in the mirror began to move independently of her own movements. The distorted version of herself took a step forward, as if trying to step out of the mirror. The scratchy sound she had heard before returned, louder and more aggressive, as if something was desperately scratching to escape confinement. The reflection on the TV continued to advance, now completely independent, until it stopped right in front of the mirror, staring at Audrey with an expression that was both familiar and terrifying. Its lips moved, forming words she couldn't hear, but which somehow seemed to materialize in her mind. It was a disturbing sensation, as if the thoughts of the reflection were blending with her own. Audrey tried to turn off the TV again, but the screen continued to ignore her attempts. The clock on the wall read 2:58 a.m., and time seemed to be dragging, each second stretching into eternity. The tension in the room was palpable, almost suffocating, and Audrey felt as if she was being pressed by an invisible force, a presence that was getting closer and closer. It was then that the image on the TV changed again. The camera now moved slowly towards the mirror door in the entrance of the house. The reflection was no longer there, and all that remained was the empty mirror, reflecting the darkness of the hallway. Audrey felt her stomach churn as the camera approached the door, each step echoing in the room as if someone was really walking there. The camera stopped in front of the mirror door, and with an almost inaudible click, the door began to open. The darkness beyond the door was total, an absolute void that seemed to call for Audrey. She took a step back, instinctively, but she couldn't take her eyes off the screen. Something was about to emerge from that void, something she couldn't face, but also couldn't escape. Then, from within the darkness, a figure began to materialize. At first, it was just an indistinct shadow, but as it approached the entrance, it became clear. The same woman Audrey had seen before in the program. Now, however, the figure seemed much more real, almost tangible, as if it was about to cross the screen and enter the room. Audrey felt adrenaline surge through her veins. She knew she needed to act, but she didn't know what to do. The figure on the TV stopped at the edge of the door, its eyes fixed on Audrey's, as if waiting for something. A sign, a command, or perhaps a surrender. The clock read 2:59 a.m. 1 minute, one single minute remained before 3 o'clock, and Audrey felt that whatever was about to happen would be the point of no return. The terror in her mind was overwhelming, but there was a growing determination inside her, a decision she knew she needed to make. But before she could make any move, the clock struck 3 o'clock. The TV turned off abruptly, plunging the room into total darkness, except for the faint glow of the moon coming through the windows. The silence that followed was almost absolute, but Audrey knew she wasn't alone. Something had changed. Something had crossed the barrier. She felt the presence in the air, a cold and oppressive energy that seemed to surround her. The true terror was yet to come, and Audrey was about to face the nightmare that was materializing around her. Darkness enveloped Audrey, and the silence in the room became unbearable. The TV, which had been the source of all the terror, was now off, but the feeling that something was wrong remained. The air was dense, almost suffocating, and every sound, no matter how small, made her heart leap. She stood still, not knowing exactly what to do next. The house felt colder, stranger, as if it was no longer the familiar place she knew. Audrey tried to rationalize, telling herself that it was all just a nightmare, but the fear was too real to ignore. There was something or someone there with her. Suddenly, a low and subtle sound broke the silence, the creaking of wood. It was as if someone was slowly walking down the hallway. The sound was soft, but loud enough to make Audrey hold her breath. Her eyes instinctively turned to the door of the living room, which led to the hallway, where the darkness seemed to gather like a dense fog. She hesitated, unsure if she should approach or stay where she was, but the fear of uncertainty, of not knowing what was happening, led her to take a step towards the door. The hallway was shrouded in shadows, but there was a faint light coming from the window at the end, where the moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting distorted silhouettes on the walls. Audrey felt a chill run down her spine as she noticed that the shadows in the hallway seemed to move, twisting as if they had a life of their own. She blinked, trying to adjust her vision to the dim light, but the shadows continued to dance unsettlingly, creating shapes that defied logic. It was then that she noticed something that made her stop in her tracks. A door at the end of the hallway, one she had never seen before. It was an old door made of dark wood, with rusty hardware and a latch that seemed to have been locked for a long time. Audrey knew every inch of her house, and that door simply shouldn't be there. Her heart raced as she realized that the door seemed to pulse slightly, as if it was alive, as if something was on the other side, waiting to be released. The sight of that door was hypnotic, and for a moment, Audrey felt an almost irresistible urge to approach, to discover what was behind it. But her survival instinct was strong, and she backed away, knowing that nothing good could come from that darkness. As she tried to decide what to do, a low, gurgling sound began to emanate from the direction of the door. It was a wet, grotesque sound, as if something was moving and dragging on the floor, mixed with an almost imperceptible whisper. Audrey froze, her entire body gripped by a paralyzing fear. She couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. It was then that the door began to slowly open, the latch releasing with a foreboding creak. The darkness on the other side seemed deeper, almost tangible, and the horrible sound grew louder, as if something was dragging itself out. Audrey finally managed to move, instinctively retreating, but keeping her eyes fixed on the door, which was now ajar. She couldn't see what was on the other side, but she could feel the presence. It was heavy, oppressive, and carried with it a sense of pure evil, as if an ancient force was about to emerge. The clock on the wall read 3:03 a.m. Time seemed to distort, each second stretching into an eternity. Audrey knew she couldn't stay there, but her legs felt like lead, unable to obey her will. Suddenly, a hand appeared in the doorway. It was a pale, almost cadaverous hand, with long, bony fingers that gripped the wood like claws. The hand stretched out, groping the air as if searching for something or someone. The gurgling sound intensified, and Audrey felt a wave of panic wash over her. She needed to get out of there, needed to run, but her feet were rooted to the floor, as if the fear itself had anchored her in place. Finally, something in her mind broke the trance. With a muffled scream, she turned and ran, her feet pounding the floor as she headed for the exit. The hallway seemed to stretch as she ran, the walls closing in around her, but she kept going, driven by pure survival instinct. She reached the front door, and with trembling hands struggled to unlock the bolt. The sound behind her grew louder, as if the thing was quickly approaching. Audrey managed to turn the latch and pull the door open with a desperate tug, stepping out into the cold night air. She ran outside without looking back and only stopped when she was far away from the house. Her heart pounded wildly, and her breath came in quick, ragged gasps. The house, which had always been her refuge, was now a prison of nightmares. Audrey knew she couldn't go back. Something terrible had been awakened that night, and she was sure it wouldn't leave her alone so easily. The nightmare was far from over, and the real struggle for survival was just beginning. Audrey was outside the house, in the cold, early morning air, but fear kept her alert, restless. The moon cast a ghostly light over the garden and surrounding trees, creating shadows that seemed to move and watch her. She looked at the house, its familiar facade now appearing sinister and threatening. The silence was absolute, except for the occasional sound of leaves rustling in the wind, which made her heart race. She knew she needed to get away from the house, but where could she go? The neighborhood was deserted, and she had nowhere to turn. The feeling that something was following her, even out here, was almost palpable. Audrey started walking, maintaining a brisk pace, her footsteps echoing on the empty sidewalk. The cold seemed to cut through her skin, and every shadow she crossed seemed to writhe, as if trying to reach her. After a few minutes of walking, she decided to take shelter in a nearby park. The trees, now more sinister under the moonlight, cast long shadows that stretched like icy fingers. Audrey sat on a bench, trying to catch her breath and calm her mind. The fear was oppressive, and her mind was filled with images of what she had seen on TV and the feeling of something indescribable following her. As she tried to gather herself, a familiar sound broke the silence, the scratching sound she had heard on the TV. It was low, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Audrey froze, her eyes scanning the park for the source of the sound. She stood up, following the noise that seemed to come from a certain direction, always with the feeling that something was watching her. The sound led her to an old gazebo in the center of the park. The gazebo, covered in cobwebs and with a broken roof, was in ruins and looked like it had been abandoned for a long time. The structure was made of dark, weathered wood, and a sense of desolation emanated from it. The scratching was louder now, as if something was trying to break free from within. Audrey approached cautiously, her footsteps muffled by the tall grass. She looked around, making sure no one was in sight. The feeling of being watched was almost overwhelming, and the fear made her stomach churn. She finally reached the entrance of the gazebo, where the sound seemed most intense. Looking inside, Audrey saw something that made her immediately recoil. A pale and indistinct figure, almost ethereal, moving among the shadows. The figure was vague and contorted, and even in the dim light, Audrey could feel its oppressive and threatening presence. She wasn't sure what she was seeing, but the sense that she was facing something that didn't belong to the real world was unmistakable. She took a step back, fear paralyzing her from moving any further. The figure in the shadow seemed to approach the edge of the gazebo, and the scratching sound intensified, as if something was trying to cross an invisible barrier. Audrey couldn't take it anymore and decided she needed to leave immediately. She ran back to the sidewalk, her fear turning every shadow into an imminent threat. Her body was exhausted and her mind was in shambles, but her survival instinct kept her moving. As she ran, her phone vibrated in her pocket, and she pulled it out with trembling hands. It was a text message, but the screen was blank, with no visible content. The text message made her heart race even more. It was as if something was trying to communicate with her in a way that couldn't be explained. Audrey tried to ignore the growing sense of despair and focused on finding a safe place. She reached a 24-hour gas station where the neon lights enveloped her, creating a sense of temporary protection. Audrey entered the establishment, her heart still racing. She explained the situation to the attendant, who looked at her with a mix of concern and doubt. Although he offered help, Audrey knew the situation was more complex than she could explain in words. As she waited, Audrey stepped away a bit to try and calm her nerves. She knew the danger hadn't passed. Something in the house seemed to have been awakened, and the connection between the TV program and what was happening to her was just the beginning of something much deeper and more disturbing. The clock at the gas station read 3:30 a.m. Audrey knew she was only beginning to understand what was happening, and the terror she had experienced was far from over. She needed to uncover the truth behind the mysterious program and what was truly threatening her life before it was too late. Audrey stayed at the gas station, trying to calm herself under the fluorescent light that contrasted sharply with the menacing darkness outside. The bright environment offered her a sense of safety, but she knew she couldn't stay there forever. The image of the pale figure in the gazebo and the persistent scratching were still fresh in her mind, and the feeling that something was lurking, waiting for her, was too strong to ignore. As she leaned against the counter, trying to find some clarity amidst the chaos, the attendant approached her again. He was an older man, with a tired look, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he knew more than he was letting on. "You're not the first to come here, fleeing from the night," he said, almost in a whisper. Audrey looked up, surprised by the statement. "I've seen others with that same look, terrified. Something is happening, something no one can explain." Audrey, still wary, asked, "What do you know about this? About what's chasing me?" The attendant hesitated for a moment before responding. "There are rumors, old stories about this town. They say there was a time when a TV program aired late at night, a program that wasn't on the official schedule. Those who watched it ended up being drawn into it, as if it was a portal to something much worse." Audrey felt a chill hearing that. It was exactly what she was experiencing. "And what happened to those people?" she asked, her voice trembling. The attendant looked directly into her eyes, as if seeing the same horror she had witnessed. "They disappeared, not in a normal way. Some were found later, but they weren't the same. Something marked them forever. Others were never seen again. They say the program is still out there, waiting to capture more souls." Audrey swallowed hard, trying to process what she was hearing. It was as if the nightmare she was living was a carefully laid trap, something beyond human comprehension. The TV, the pale figure, the scratching sound, everything was part of a much larger plan, a web that was slowly closing in around her. "I need to end this," Audrey whispered, more to herself than to the attendant. "I can't let this continue." The attendant nodded, as if he had been expecting this response. "You need to go back," he said, with a gravity that made Audrey's heart sink. "Whatever started in that house can only be ended there. But be careful. The darkness you'll face will be greater than anything you've ever seen." Audrey knew he was right. Running wouldn't help. She had been marked by something that wouldn't leave her alone, and the only way to free herself was to face what was hunting her. After thanking the attendant, she forced herself to leave the gas station, the cold of the night enveloping her again. Every step back to the house felt heavier, as if an invisible force was trying to stop her from continuing. The path she had taken earlier now seemed much longer and more threatening. As she walked, her phone vibrated again. She looked at the screen and saw another blank message. This time, a sense of despair washed over her. It was as if the program itself was trying to communicate, reminding her that time was running out. Something inside her told her the end was near, but what that meant was still a mystery. When she finally reached the front of her house, Audrey stopped to look at the dark structure before her. The house seemed more sinister than ever, as if it were alive and pulsating with evil energy. The front door was ajar, which made her hesitate for a moment, but she knew there was no other choice. Entering cautiously, Audrey felt the temperature drop even further. The house was completely silent, but the feeling of being watched was almost tangible. She knew she wasn't alone. The hallway that once seemed to stretch infinitely now felt even more oppressive. Every step she took echoed, and the shadows on the walls seemed to writhe like living beings. She headed toward the living room, where everything had started. The TV was there, turned off, but the oppressive presence she had felt before was still strong. Audrey felt a wave of nausea as she approached, as if a part of her was being sucked into the device. It was then that she heard it, the voice, a low, almost inaudible whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was as if someone was speaking directly into her mind. Audrey strained to comprehend the words, but all she could understand was a clear command: "Come." The command made her body tremble, but it also gave her renewed determination. She knew she was close to discovering what was behind all of this. Somehow, the program, the pale figure, and the door that had appeared in the hallway were connected to something much older and more evil than she could imagine. The clock on the wall read 3:45 a.m. Time was running out, and Audrey knew there was no turning back. She was about to face the darkness directly, and whatever was lurking was waiting for her. The tension inside the house was palpable. The clock read 3:45 a.m., and Audrey knew that time was against her. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the soft sound of her own footsteps as she walked toward the living room. The TV was off, but the feeling of being watched was more intense than ever. It was as if the device was waiting, eager to be turned on again. Audrey hesitated, feeling the weight of what she was about to do. Everything inside her screamed to run, but she knew she had no choice. If she wanted to survive, she had to face whatever was hidden there. With trembling hands, she picked up the remote control and, with one last breath of courage, pressed the button to turn on the TV. The screen flickered to life, but instead of the channel she expected, the same disturbing broadcast from before appeared. The static noise dominated the image, and those same distorted, almost recognizable figures danced on the screen. However, this time there was something different. A sense of presence, as if those figures were aware of being watched. Audrey fixed her gaze on the screen, trying to understand what she was seeing. The figures moved in an almost hypnotic way, as if trying to communicate something. Suddenly, the image stabilized for a second, and Audrey saw something that made her freeze. A distorted version of herself, sitting on the sofa, exactly where she was. It was her, but at the same time, it wasn't. The image on the screen was a version of her, pale with empty eyes and an expression of pure despair. The sight made her recoil in horror, but her eyes remained fixed on the screen. The figure on the TV began to move, standing up from the sofa and slowly walking toward the camera, as if approaching Audrey. Panic began to rise inside her, but something prevented her from turning off the TV. It was as if the remote control was glued to her hands, unable to be released. As the figure on the screen drew closer, the scratching sound Audrey had heard before began again, now louder and closer. She looked around, trying to locate the source of the sound, but couldn't see anything. The figure on the screen, now almost filling the entire image, abruptly stopped. Its face was so close to the camera that Audrey could see every horrific detail. The sunken eyes, the pale wrinkled skin, and the slightly open mouth, as if it were about to whisper something. Then the whisper came, but not from the TV. It came from within the house, from the walls, the floor, as if the very structure was alive and conspiring against her. The words were indistinct, but the tone was clear. A call, a command to surrender to the darkness. Audrey began to back away, but something stopped her. The scratching was now a scraping sound coming directly from behind her. She turned slowly and saw the hallway door, the same one that shouldn't exist, wide open. The darkness emanating from within it was so dense, it seemed to swallow the light around it. A living, pulsating darkness, filled with a malevolence that Audrey could feel in her soul. The whisper became a low, agonizing scream, and from the depths of the darkness, something began to emerge. First, there were pale, bony hands, similar to those she had seen in the gazebo. Then, an entire figure began to materialize, a shadow that seemed to grow and stretch as it advanced. It was the figure from the TV, the distorted version of Audrey, but now much more terrifying. The figure crawled out of the darkness, its movements disjointed and unnatural. Each step it took made the walls tremble, as if the very house was reacting to its presence. Audrey backed up to the sofa, her heart racing uncontrollably, but she knew there was nowhere to run. The figure stopped a few feet away, and the lights in the room began to flicker, casting macabre shadows in all directions. The TV, still on, now showed a black void, reflecting the despair that filled the room. Then the figure spoke, with a voice that seemed to be a combination of Audrey's and something much older and more evil. "You belong to us," the voice said, echoing in her mind. "Your fate was sealed the moment you tuned in." Audrey, despite the terror, felt a wave of anger. It wasn't fair. She hadn't asked for this, hadn't done anything to deserve such a fate. She wasn't going to give up without a fight. Gathering all the strength she had left, she looked directly at the figure and said, "I won't give in." The figure smiled, a distorted smile that made Audrey's blood run cold. "You've already given in, from the first moment. There is no escape. Come, join us." The darkness around the figure seemed to extend, as if it were an extension of itself, trying to envelop Audrey. The fear paralyzed her for a moment, but she knew she had to act. With a quick motion, she grabbed the remote control and pressed the button to turn off the TV with all her might. For a second, nothing happened. But then the TV went off, and the room was plunged into complete darkness. The silence that followed was deafening. The figure stopped, its eyes fixed on Audrey, but the connection had been severed. However, the victory was brief. The walls began to tremble, and the sound of cracks echoed through the house. The darkness of the figure seemed to be raging, as if it was being rejected but not yet defeated. Audrey knew the worst was yet to come. The house was plunged into oppressive darkness, broken only by the sound of the walls trembling and the distant echo of the persistent whisper. Audrey felt the weight of terror on her shoulders, but something inside her refused to give up. The remote control was still in her hands, now useless, but symbolizing the only action she could still take: resist. The figure, that distorted version of herself, remained motionless, but the darkness around it seemed to pulse with an evil energy, as if it were feeding on Audrey's fear. The cracks in the walls began to expand, revealing deep chasms that seemed to lead to an infinite void. The floor shook, and the feeling that the house was on the verge of collapse grew stronger. Audrey knew she couldn't run. There was nowhere to go. Every step she took led her deeper into the nightmare. But an idea began to form in her mind. That thing, that figure, was connected to the TV, to the program, and to the portal that had opened within the house. If she could somehow break that connection, she might have a chance. But how? The answer seemed to slip through her fingers like fine sand until her eyes fell on the remote control once again. The figure hadn't moved since the TV was turned off, as if it were stuck between two worlds. If the TV was the connection, then maybe destroying the only thing that allowed the connection was the answer. Without thinking twice, Audrey stood up, her eyes fixed on the figure. "If you want to take me," she said, her voice trembling but determined, "you'll have to face me." The figure smiled again, a cruel and cynical smile. "You can't escape. We are everywhere, and we always will be. You are ours." Audrey ignored the words, focusing on what she needed to do. With the remote control still in her hand, she raised it, and with all the strength she could muster, threw it directly at the TV screen. The impact was immediate and explosive. The screen shattered into thousands of pieces, scattering shards of glass all over the room. At that moment, the figure let out a deafening scream, as if it were experiencing intense pain. The darkness around it began to writhe violently, as if it were being torn apart by an invisible force. Audrey backed away, shielding her face from the flying shards of glass. The figure began to dissolve, its distorted form crumbling like sand in the wind. The darkness surrounding it also began to disappear, sucked into the cracks in the walls, which slowly began to close. The figure's scream echoed in Audrey's mind, but it was a sound of defeat, not of threat. With each passing second, the house seemed to return to normal. The darkness dissipated and the oppressive feeling lessened. The walls, once menacing, were now firm and silent. Audrey watched as the last shadow disappeared and the figure finally disintegrated completely. The agonizing whisper was replaced by absolute silence, and for the first time since it all began, the house was at peace. She stood there for a moment, panting and in shock, before finally collapsing to her knees. The terror had passed, but the scars left by it were still deeply etched in her mind. Time seemed to have stopped, but when she looked at the clock on the wall, Audrey saw that it was 3:59 a.m. 1 minute before 4 o'clock. She had survived. Somehow, by facing the darkness and breaking the connection with that cursed world, she had managed to save her own life. Audrey slowly got to her feet, feeling exhaustion take over her body. The house was quiet, almost peaceful, as if nothing strange had happened. But she knew the scars of that nightmare would stay with her forever. She walked to the front door and stepped out into the cool, early morning air. The sky was beginning to lighten on the horizon, and the first rays of sunlight promised a new day. Audrey took a deep breath, trying to clear her mind and reconnect with reality. Before leaving the house forever, Audrey looked back at the structure that had almost swallowed her whole. There was something sinister about that house, something she had inadvertently disturbed, but which was now dormant once again. She knew she would never return there, but she also knew that what she had faced wasn't completely destroyed, only contained. As the sun finally rose, Audrey began to walk down the deserted street, leaving behind the house, the nightmare, and the longest night of her life. She knew the world was full of mysteries and horrors beyond human comprehension, but she also knew that somehow she had survived one of them. And that, in itself, was a victory. Audrey never watched TV alone at night again.